Okay, so we're going to continue part two here by looking at the continued expansion of the United States. So the first thing here to look at is Spain gives up Florida in 1819. So you can see Florida right here, and you can see on this map it's actually got two different colors because Spain ended up giving over the west part first, which is now part of Mississippi and Alabama, and then the rest of Florida later. And basically what happened there is uh, what we could call Anglo settlers, so those that speak English, kept settling into this land, coming in from the U.S. and coming across the border when borders couldn't really be patrolled and settling in. And so Spain found itself with a colony that had a lot of English speakers and was also very expensive to maintain, and they'd already lost a bunch of other land nearby, and they're just like, we can't deal with this. So they gave it up through a series of more complex than I'm describing situations. So that's how we got Florida. And then Britain and the U.S. set Canada-U.S. boundary here. So at this point, Canada is still part of Britain. And there was this land that was sort of Louisiana Purchase here that was technically ours. And there was some land here that was technically Canada. And there was, a little debate about it all. And finally, we just decided, what, we're just going to draw the line at the 49th parallel. Above will be Canada, and below will be U.S., and it'll be easier to navigate than this crazy boundary. So basically, we lost a little land, they lost a little land, and that's how we got that nice, clean line. Okay. Now, this is not how we got new land, but let's talk about this thing called the Monroe Doctrine. Okay, so basically what it was a foreign policy philosophy. So at this point, most of the countries that now exist in the Americas had gotten their independence. They had fought. So countries like Venezuela, Colombia, Mexico, that used to all be part of Spain, right? Spanish colonies, like we've talked about, were getting their independence. And so the U.S. decided that it wanted to try to be the older big brother. Like, hey, we were the first country on this hemisphere to get our independence, and we want to be the older big brother and kind of be the leader, right? Because we want to be a leader. So just like kind of Britain is for the rest of the world, we want to be that for the Americas. And so, just like we kicked out the Europeans and everyone else kicking out the Europeans, the Monroe Doctrine was basically a notice to European countries that said, stay out of the Western Hemisphere, right? We are in control, stay out, okay? And we're going to enforce kind of that idea, and if you're going to bully any of these other little countries, then we're going to get involved. And the idea was that U.S. would become the new power in the Western Hemisphere. That was the hope of those in the government at this point. So why is this going on? One reason is we just fought the War of 1812, and in the view of many in the government, showed that we could go toe-to-toe with Britain. So because we go toe-to-toe with them, then we can now handle our own affairs and our own continent. So Britain, you can have the other continents, but we're going to handle our own. Okay? And what we saw was that before the War of 1812, we were kind of operating almost like each state kind of a little bit like its own country. And the War of 1812 starts to unify America as, no, we are one country. And that's going to create that sense of, now we're one country, now we're looking outwards, right? And like I mentioned, we're looking outwards, and what we're seeing is that all of those colonies of New Spain are now breaking away just like we did and becoming their own countries. And so the U.S. says, we're going to protect them, we're going to be the big brother, we're going to be the leader of the Americas. Maybe we can't be the leader of big bagged Europe and all of those countries, but we can be the leader of our own little hemisphere. So that was kind of the hope, was that the U.S. could become not a world power, but a regional power, and we were going to tell the Europeans to stay away. So we call that the Monroe Doctrine. Okay. And coupled with the Monroe Doctrine, we start to see again that unification of America come together through um, a few different leaders in the U.S. government coming up with something called the American system. And again, American here, we're not looking at individual states. They saw that the federal government could do more to unite the whole country into one thing. So this is what we call, in a sense, nationalism. Now, nationalism is kind of looked at a little differently in the US than the traditional view. The traditional view of nationalism would be a country for a nation of people. So Germans should all live in Germany, and Frenchmen should all live in France. Englishmen should all live in England. But the US, as we know, is a melting pot. A melting pot. But there was this idea that we're going to be one unified force. Okay? And part of how they went about doing those things was first tariffs here. So if it's expensive to get goods from other countries, then you're going to get them from other states where you don't have to pay a tariff. So that's going to unite Americans. It's going to be Americans trading with Americans, selling to Americans, buying from Americans. So that's going to unify us together, and we're going to help each other out, was kind of the idea. And the second one was a national bank, and we'd seen this idea first creep up with Alexander Hamilton, if you can remember, those of you that love Hamilton. And it's going to come back again, this idea that the U.S. government would operate a bank, not in the Constitution, but that by doing so, it would control even more so the money and the debt that was going around in the country. And the third thing was these projects that were across multiple states. So normally, things like roads are controlled by the states. If a state wants a road, it builds a road. It maintains the road, pays the cost of that. And so we saw this movement towards building a national road that was going to be paid for in part by the federal government and run between multiple states. And this is kind of the forerunner to what comes later, which is the Eisenhower interstate system, where you get the highways, right? So, I-69, I-475, I-75, those are all interstates, right? Those are highways that the federal government has dictated, and they run between the states to help connect and help with trade. And so this was kind of the first example of this, building a national road that went through multiple states. And then the Erie Canal was a path for ships, and it was going to connect, again, multiple states together by building basically a giant ditch or canal that ships could travel between, so that goods could travel from the Great Lakes all the way into New York. And so that's going to actually help cities like Chicago and New York City become even more important, because now these were hubs where someone from even, like, let's say Iowa could have something, and they could send it to Chicago. It could get on a boat in Chicago and sail all the way to New York City. And so that is going to, again, help connect the nation, but it's part of this idea of let's be unified, this American system. We see this movement towards unifying, not just in our emotions and ideas of what it means to be a country, but literally building roads and canals to connect the United States. One person that we've talked about briefly because he was the victor at the Battle of New Orleans was Andrew Jackson. We said that he kind of, like many successful military leaders, was able to springboard that success to become president, and he does that as well. But he's kind of a unique president at this time, different from some of the presidents that came before him. He also hated the national bank idea. And so let's look at what made him special. One of the things that made him special was the fact that he was voted in by common people. And so at this time, we know that the slaves could not vote, and we know that women could not vote. But in fact, a lot of people couldn't vote because a lot of voting rights at this time was tied to your ability to own property, which means only the wealthy are going to be able to vote. But what happens is we see a movement to get rid of a lot of those restrictions so that poor people would be able to vote. And Andrew Jackson was kind of the first person to capitalize on the common man and appeal to them. His parties that he threw was sometimes like literally like, here's a lot of cheese, here's a lot of wine. And so he appealed to the common man and was able to use these new voters that hadn't had a chance to vote before to become president in 1828. Okay? And Andrew Jackson is a very particular person. He hates the British. He also is not nice at all to the Native Americans, and basically ignores a Supreme Court decision that said that you have to respect the Native American rights as their own nations, and you have to negotiate with them like they're another nation. And he basically was like, no, let's just get rid of them. So this is where you get things like the Trail of Tears, where Native Americans are being kicked out of the states on the eastern seaboard of the U.S., those original 13 colonies, and sent to places like Oklahoma to live on reservations. Um, Andrew Jackson also, when he became president, appointed a lot of the people that helped him get there. Now, this in some sense is a pretty common thing, right? Like, okay, you supported my campaign, so now I'm going to let you have a position in the government. But a lot of people thought that Andrew Jackson took this way too far. And instead of appointing people that would be good at the various positions, he simply appointed people that had helped him or given him money and weren't necessarily qualified to be good at their position. So a lot of people felt like this was not good, and so they called it the spoils system, right? To the victor goes the spoils. And so the victors that had helped Jackson win, they got these positions of power. Okay, there's a lot of complicated government stuff going on politically. I'm not going to dwell too much on it, but nowadays when we think of the parties, we think of the Democrats and the Republicans. But at this point, the Republican Party didn't even exist yet. So you had a group called actually the Democrat Republicans, one party which we would now call the Democrats, and the Whigs. And there's a lot that goes on where basically Jackson is so controversial that he starts to split these political parties up. Okay, he hated the Bank of the U.S., like I mentioned earlier, and so he gets rid of attacks the second bank that was part of that American system we just talked about to get rid of it. Okay, and he survived an assassination attempt, which is going to become more common when we get into the late 1800s for U.S. presidents to be attempted to be assassinated. Okay, and remember his appeal. What made him unique was that he appealed to what we call popular, meaning the people, and not the rich aristocrats. Right, his base, so to speak, to use the term. The people that supported him were not necessarily rich aristocrats, but the common people, right? He got a lot of votes from sort of the poor people, okay? Of course, his political rivals might say from the uneducated people, right? The uneducated masses that don't know what they're talking about versus, the educated aristocrats. But that's what worked for him, okay? And came out of South Carolina there. All right, let's get back to more expansion of the U.S. And it's going to start with Texas. And what we're going to see is a similar story to what we saw with Florida, where basically these English-speaking settlers are going to come from the U.S. and they're going to move into the region that is Texas. Now, Texas at this point was controlled by Mexico, which is one of these new countries that broke away from Spain. And it actually started out as not an illegal crossing, but Mexico actually invited Anglo settlers. They wanted their country to grow. They wanted to bring in more investment, and so they invited people to come live. The U.S. said, hey, there's a bunch of English speakers here. Let's buy this land. Mexico said no. But there was a lot of conflicts. Okay, so The Anglo settlers, what do they bring? We mentioned that they speak English. That's already going to create sort of this language barrier between them and the rest of Mexico. They're also going to bring different religion, right? Most of Mexico at this point is going to be Roman Catholic, and most of these Anglo settlers are going to be some version of English church. It might be Methodist, it might be an Anglican Episcopalian, maybe they're Presbyterians, but they're not going to be Roman Catholic. So that's going to bring a religious barrier. And then a lot of these Anglo settlers coming from the southern U.S. to what would be northern Mexico are going to bring slaves, which was a no-no in Mexico. Now, we had seen the Spanish did not always treat people well, but at this point, slavery was a no-no in Mexico, but was still right allowed in the southern U.S. And so that's going to create conflict. These Anglo settlers felt like, hey, this is not working out for us. Let's become our own country. So they rebelled against Mexico. Okay, and they won, and they formed their own country, the Republic of Texas. Okay, and what's going to happen eventually is that the U.S. is going to annex or take control of the Republic of Texas, and they're basically just going to bring it into the United States and say this is now part of the United States. So it was its own country for a very, very brief amount of time, and then it's going to be brought into the United States. If you are interested in this kind of pattern of how you take over a country, a similar situation happened in Ukraine in 2016, I believe. No, 2014. 2014. Where Russia took over part of Ukraine, where there was a bunch of Russians, and basically they went in and set up sort of a puppet government, and then the puppet government voted to join Russia. And so this region of Ukraine is, from the Russians' perspective, now part of Russia, but by Ukraine has been taken over and is still part of Ukraine. And so there's this conflict there. Okay, now Texas becomes part of the U.S., breaks away from Mexico, becomes part of the U.S., but we still have a problem. And the problem is, where is the actual boundary now that separates Texas, which is now in the U.S., from Mexico? And that boundary problem is going to be one of great debate, and it's going to lead to the Mexican-American War. Okay? So the Mexican-American War is fought from, as you can see, 1846 to 1848, and basically, I'm sorry, Mexico loses pretty badly in this war. The U.S. was kind of itching for war and was ready for it, and they kind of, kick Mexico's butt, so to speak. Okay? And what ends up happening is they march their army down to Mexico City, Mexico surrenders, and the U.S. takes over a bunch of land from Mexico at the end of the war, 1848. And they do buy it technically, but they buy it for super cheap, right? So $15 million, they're going to buy a ton of land after winning this war against Mexico. Then a few years later, they're going to buy very little land for $10 million. So you can see just how much land they got and what a good deal this $15 million was. So let's take a look at the map here. So Mexico, when it breaks away from Spain, is actually really large. So here's Mexico, and it was all of this dark blue plus all of this lighter blue and all of this red. So Mexico was really quite large when it broke away from Spain. But then we see Texas breaks away, right? And from Mexico's perspective, this was Texas. This was the Republic of Texas that they recognized that then joined the U.S. But from Texas's perspective, right, this was the Republic of Texas with this light red as well. And so that was the border dispute, and basically that's what started the war. Was the U.S. said, hey, there's Mexican soldiers on our land, but that land was in that disputed territory. Mexico said, no, that's our land, and so that's why our soldiers are there. And the U.S. said, no, that's our land. You have soldiers on our land. You're invading us, and then hence the war. Okay, so after the war, we bought almost all of this light blue for $15 million, except for this tiny little bit down here, which is what we bought for $10 million a few years later. Okay, so we got all of this for 15 mil. California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, except for this tiny little bit of Arizona we got for 10 million later. And the border that we recognize with the Rio Grande River here as the border is what got recognized. And so now we see Texas as it is today. Texas was its own country, but when it joined the U.S., it joined as a state just like the other states. And Mexico lost, right, about half its land. Okay, so that's how we got a huge chunk of the U.S. Now let's talk about the top of the U.S. So here's the bottom here. Louisiana Territory is up here, right? And then here's where we got those states. So how do we get these ones? Basically, similar thing starts happening where Anglo settlers start settling in this area, which is now Montana, Wyoming, Idaho, and then Washington and Oregon, especially Washington and Oregon. People like to settle near rivers and near coasts, right? And so a lot of people lived in the East Coast, and now a lot of people want to move to this west coast of the U.S. And this whole area here, what we call the Oregon country, was debated between Britain and the U.S. Was it part of Canada? Was it part of the U.S.? There was no sort of magic line that had been drawn, and so settlers are coming from both places and just kind of settling in this area that was claimed by both. And it was okay, it was peaceful. So eventually, after some time had passed, they decided to do kind of what they did before. Hey, this 49th parallel here, which we used to divide Canada and the U.S. back in 1818, let's just extend it. So they extended it, and everything in north became part of Canada, everything south part of the U.S., and they drew a nice firm line, except for this little bit of Vancouver Island here, which remained south. But other than that, nice clean line, and that's how we get this nice clean line. Basically, Britain and the U.S. were willing to play nice with each other, and so that's what we get. So here is the full map, and you can see here is the U.S. when we got our independence, and then we basically swapped some land with Britain here. We lost a little land, and they lost a little land. We got the Louisiana Territory, we got Texas, then we beat Mexico in the war, and we got this area for 15 million, and then down here the Gadsden Purchase here for 10 million, and then this was claimed by both us and Britain, and we kind of just decided to continue that line, draw the line, and then we made a few adjustments here that I didn't talk about. Again, land claimed by both, and just kind of settled the line there with Britain. Okay, and that's how we get the 48 states that make up the continental U.S. Hawaii and Alaska will come later. We'll actually buy Alaska not that much later, and we'll annex Hawaii just a little bit later, but it's going to take them a long time before they become states. And so all of this land will become states by the early 1900s, and Hawaii and Alaska will wait until I believe it's 1959 to become states. Now, what this does is it changes the idea of the United States. And we get this new concept that we call manifest destiny that we first see in 1845 in a newspaper written by a newspaper editor. And basically it has to do with this. We're getting all this new land. 1846, 1848, right? 1846 Oregon Country, 1848 Mexican Succession. And people want to move to the West Coast, and the U.S. in a very short amount of time gained a large amount of land. And so, in a sense, the whole destiny and shape of the country was changed, and manifest destiny was this idea that the U.S. was going to push across the wilderness that was the middle of the country, and conquer this whole land from sea to shining sea, so to speak, from the East Coast to the West Coast. It was our destiny to expand across. And so some things spur that. We get this new land in 1948, and part of that new land was California. I'm just going to flip back to the map right here. And what did they find in California 1 year later? Gold, right? And so a bunch of people start moving to California for the gold rush, which is where you get the 49ers, like the San Francisco 49ers. And California gets so many people that even though it was brand new, 2 years ago the U.S. got it, it becomes a state in 1850. And so you kind of have this weird situation where there's states over here, and then there's a bunch of territory that doesn't have enough people to be a state, and then California over here on the complete other side is a state of the United States. Okay, 1850. And basically here, Oregon Trail, Santa Fe Trail, Old Spanish Trail, these are just ways that settlers moved across the country. These are the trails that they took to move across the country. Okay, now this country is not empty. There's Native Americans, but the idea was kind of that it was this empty wilderness and the U.S. was going to conquer it. And so one of the things I'm going to have you do is look into this treaty of Fort Laramie. Okay, so one example of a people that moved was the Mormons, right? Utah is a place where we see a lot of Mormons, but they actually started in New York. They moved to Illinois, continued to be persecuted for their religious beliefs, and eventually they just kept moving to Utah. Okay, and so this is kind of the picture that embodies this idea of manifest destiny. It's called American Progress, and you can see here you kind of have the spirit of America in progress, and it's being showed by she's literally laying telegraph wire, which was an early way to communicate pre-telephone, right? You see the train is moving west, and the Native Americans are being kicked out, and people are settling the land and transforming it into farmland, etc., etc. And you see the buffalo running away across the mountains. And so when I say that this changed the landscape of the U.S., it literally did change the land, right? We got a lot more land. But it changed even the idea. Like now, let's say an immigrant can move to the U.S., and they don't even have to be in New York City. They can move and get their own land, right? There was so much land that they were basically just giving it out for free to people that would claim it. Get your 12 acres and you can settle down and you can own the land if you farm it for a few years. A lot of these territories were just handing out land. So now people were moving from the East Coast to the West Coast or moving to the middle of the country, settling down to get their free land and farming it. And so there was this even more already there was this sense that, immigrants could come to the U.S. and get a new start. But now it was like a completely new start. You can get your own land and in the middle of the country. And so this idea of manifest destiny might be a little harsh towards the fact that this land was actually lived in by tons of Native Americans, but it created this idea that the U.S. was supposed to be this powerful force across this entire land and that it was our fate to do so.